Well, welcome, David. It's so good to have you on this morning with us, and really excited about jumping in this morning. This is my friend David, Dr. David Johnson, that is, and he is an expert on Revelation. I think he can claim that title. He's probably studied that more than anything else in his entire life, and certainly more than you and I. And so it's really looking forward to sitting down with him and asking him some questions about Revelation, because we're going to be jumping into a series and kind of hopping around and looking what Revelation may be saying to us during this time in which we live. David wrote a book on this, a scholarly book. He's also written articles, and so he's going to distill some of his insights down for us this morning, and really looking forward to jumping in. So thanks so much for doing this, David. Really appreciate it.
Oh, yeah. No problem. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, let's go ahead and jump in. So, David, why don't you tell us, obviously we know each other, but David, why don't you tell us a little bit of our congregation about yourself, about what you're up to right now, and kind of how you got interested in Revelation in the first place, because I think Revelation for most of us is something that we kind of stay away from because we don't really understand it. So, how did you get so interested in Revelation?
Well, honestly, it's always been there for me. I can remember very distinctly in youth group, and as some of you all may have be familiar with the Left Behind movies with Kirk Cameron. And I remember one time during one of our youth group services, we weren't going to have any of the singing or preaching or anything. We're just going to watch the Left Behind movie and kind of a series of Wednesday nights to watch them. And I was excited, right? I've always been very interested in the book. It's such a fascinating book. So I remember very distinctly on this Wednesday night, bringing my Bible, having it in hand, open it to Revelation 1. And as the credits rolled on the movie, the first scenes, I'm trying to track between my Bible and the movie. And of course, within 5 minutes, I learned that they didn't have a lot in common in terms of just kind of following the biblical text.
Yeah.
So that was my first, one of my very first kind of encounters that I remember. But it's just always fascinated me. So I went to college to a Christian school, and one of the courses I ended up taking was a book on Revelation. And what the professor did there is something that I never quite have encountered, surprisingly, is that when he taught it, the central theme is what does this book say to the church today? We do that for every other book, but for some reason with Revelation, at least my experience was always something to happen in the future and had very little to say to us. And so, that was transformative for me. And I just continued with it from there, going on to grad school and eventually it becoming my PhD thesis topic, which was the role of the Spirit and discernment in the book of Revelation, right? And so you can tell it's not just about discernment for the future, but ways in which we can kind of discern the book for us today.
That's so good. That's so good. And yeah, like you said, it is interesting because oftentimes we read scripture in a certain way. We try to kind of understand at least somewhat the context in which, it was written in and also who was written in, all those things. But it seems like for a lot of us, we kind of read Revelation as a kind of a roadmap to something way, way, way down the road. And kind of like you said, whether it's we're watching a movie and trying to find it, or we're looking at, the news or a newspaper and trying to see what's going on. What's kind of wrong with those approaches?
Yeah, I just think it's how we don't approach any other book, right? It's so simple, but it's so true. In so many ways, the book of Revelation, why it 100% has things to talk about the future. And it 100% has things that it said, right, to the first readers, the first audience that heard it. All other books, or many of the other books in our biblical canon, function in that way as well. And it was just very surprising to me, and continues to be, as I reflect back, why Revelation kind of had this special place in our churches. And there's basically like two streams, as you kind of started off. One kind of just ignores it.
Yeah.
Right? It's hard to understand. I don't know what's going on, so I'm just not going to read it. And then the other side, they don't exactly read the text, right? In the way that the movies don't exactly kind of convey everything in the book of Revelation. Yeah. But there's this kind of, script or idea of things that it's for the future alone. And I don't know, I struggle with that consistently. What does Revelation have to say to us today?
Yeah, well, that's good. Well, why don't we kind of get into the mind of you as a professor, because you teach students about Revelation. I mean, what typically, when you're trying to help your students, kind of like, such as yourself, when you were going into college and you have a lot of, you don't understand a lot of Revelation, and you're trying to kind of give your students a framework for how do we approach this book? How do we approach this text? What are some of the ways that you help your students understand Revelation and kind of talk to them about this wonderful book?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the first things I always do, it would be something like giving a structure to the book. Right, all of these books in the canon, right, they have some sort of structure. And what I mean by that is they have certain movements. There's certain progressions in the story, right? So if we think about a gospel, we think it begins with Jesus' birth. Then it moves to Jesus' ministry early on. Then it moves to Jesus' journey to Jerusalem that leads, to his death and resurrection, right? That's just kind of the basic story or structure of the Gospels. And so Revelation has kind of a story or a structure like that. And so the first thing I try to talk about is what it is about, what is kind of the central thrust of this story or this narrative. And so a few things I usually go over is one, the very first verse, that Revelation is the term is apocalypse, right? Apocalypsis. It means the unveiling or the revelation, right? That's how we translate it into English. Mm-hmm. And so we're so familiar for the term revelation. Sometimes we don't think about what it means. And what it means is the unveiling or revelation of Jesus. Right? Throughout Revelation, what we consistently encounter and discover is who Jesus is. Yeah. And it's a expression of Jesus as the resurrected Jesus, right? So it's a Jesus that we don't quite encounter as much in the gospel, right? The post-resurrection activities of Jesus. But that's what Revelation is all about, right? It's about that post-resurrection Jesus and encountering him. So again, just as we think about what do we do with the book, right? Do we just ignore it, or is it just about the future? But if we ground it in the idea that it is essentially about knowing or understanding who Jesus is, that's a much different way to read it. Especially, again, I don't know how everyone read the Bible growing up, but in Sunday school, when we ask, who went onto the ark with Noah, the answer is Jesus. Right? The answer is always Jesus. Oh, Jesus, yes. And it was astounding to me that Revelation has so much to say about Jesus, but it was consistently kind of Jesus list and different things that I heard about it. Yeah. A second thing that I always do is then just kind of, in the way I talked about the structure of a gospel, the structure of Revelation. So it's a revelation of Jesus Christ. And at the very beginning, we meet the resurrected Jesus right through John. He encounters him on Patmos, and then he is instructed by Jesus to give the 7 prophetic messages, which if, anyone kind of talks about Revelation today, it tends to be, or they feel most comfortable in the 7 prophetic messages, right? Which are great. They're important. But after the 7 prophetic messages, right, that's where it starts to get really I'll say interesting.
Yeah.
Some may say difficult. But we are transported with John into the heavenly throne room, right? And John sees this beautiful sight of what the one on the throne looks like, the Spirit, and the Lamb that's on the throne. But there's a detail that's fascinating that I didn't pick up until kind of later in my life. Is that what the one on the throne has, or what kind of that central story begins? Is that the one on the throne has a sealed scroll, and there's nobody on heaven or earth who's worthy to open it. But then John turns and he sees someone who is worthy, right? It's the slaughtered lamb, the lamb who looks like he was slain, but is able to stand on the divine throne. And what's the lamb do? He's worthy to take the scroll. Right? Then we jump to, without even thinking about the connections, to Revelation 6, right? We know about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. But what the 4 horsemen are the opening of the first 4 seals of that scroll. Right. And so that whole kind of stretch from 6 through 9 that has just crazy imagery, scorpion tails and lion face, right? Very, very interesting and striking detail. All of this is related to each of these seals being opened one by one. And so once all the seals are open, what do we have? In Revelation 10, an angel coming down with a scroll in his hand that is now unsealed. Right. So from 5 all the way to 10, what we're basically encountering is this story of how to open up this scroll. And so now that it's finally open, the mighty angel gives it to John. And John, like Daniel, like Ezekiel, he takes that scroll and it says he eats it. Right. It's like he's taking the words of God, right? What the scroll seems to represent is the prophecy that he used to give. The words of God are now inside him, and they're sweet on his tongue, and they're hard on his stomach. And so once he receives this prophecy, he, like any prophet, prophesies. And so we get then, as we move through 11, as we move through chapter 12, all the way through 16. What I understand to be is just John's prophecy to the church. And the center of that prophecy is Revelation 11, where we meet these 2 witnesses, right? We're very familiar with the 2 witnesses. We always want to know, right, who is it, right? Is it Elijah? Is it Enoch? Is it Moses? But Revelation is usually not this helpful to us. Revelation is full of imagery, but usually doesn't tell us what the imagery is. And this is why it can be such a challenge to understand it. But the 2 witnesses are called to 2 lampstands. Well, we learned all the way in chapter 1 that the lampstands represent the church. And so these 2 witnesses are in some way an embodiment or representation of the anointed, right, Spirit-empowered prophetic church. And so what do? They prophesy. They prophesy to the inhabitants of the earth. They prophesy to a hostile world. And when their prophecy is completed, they die for 3.5 days, which kind of recalls Jesus and his time in the grave. They're raised from the dead by the Spirit, and then they are ascended into heaven. Right. This to me is the central story of the book of Revelation, which all the way in 5 is kind of leading towards, is that it is a story about the church and how they respond to a hostile world. And through a true and faithful witness, it's to follow the example that the 2 witnesses lay forth. One thing that's fascinating is 11 is the first time we encounter the beast, right? We're always looking for it, but it's not until halfway through the book that the beast even appears. And so what 12 and 16 is just kind of a retelling or a recapitulation of what's happening in 11, where the beast gets a kind of full-fledged characterization and understanding. We learn all the details about who the beast is and the way that the beast opposes the people of God. And so the end then kind of has a dual ending, right? You can identify with the great whore of Babylon, or you can identify with the bride of Christ, the New Jerusalem. So that, I think that's one of the most important things. I know it's a little lengthy of an explanation, but it's a way to think, if we can think through that progression, right? That it's about John receiving his prophecy, and that his prophecy is about the church. That kind of lens, I think, is extremely helpful in understanding the book better.
That's really good. And so, what you're trying to say, we're trying to tell us, is that it's not necessarily just about trying to find all these different clues about what's happening in the future. But what you're telling us is that there's a sense in which we are taken in with John to this vision that he's having of Jesus, and he's leading them through of how not just these 7 churches that he mentions, but the church, how we're supposed to begin to respond to the difficult things and the persecutions and all the things that we face, not just in the future, in the past, but actually right now, today.
Yeah.
And so there's so much for us. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so I'd love to hear you, because we're going to get to the beast and all of that kind of stuff. There's all sorts of stuff surrounding that. But kind of just a brief question is, what do you think? What are a few things you think that when you look at the book of Revelation, kind of leading into this idea of there's so much here for the church? What do you think are some of the things that Revelation has to say to the church right now?
Yeah. Right. At first, where we kind of mine so much of our what we're so familiar with already is the 7 prophetic messages. And there is, so much kind of symbolization in the book. One of those is why there are 7 churches. If you look on a map and kind of trace out in Asia Minor, you'll notice that this makes like a perfect mail delivery of each of those 7 churches. But they're not the only 7 churches on this route, right? There could have been a few more added, but 7 is kind of a theologically rich number in the biblical literature, going all the way back to 7 days of creation, where it kind of represents the fullness or the complete church in the case of Revelation, or the fullness of creation all the way back to Genesis. And so what it tells for me is that first, when we look at Revelation and the 7 messages, we can see a diversity of the church in these messages. We see some of the churches, like Philadelphia, they're facing persecution. They're experiencing death from outside powers who are coming against them and acting violently towards them. But we see other expressions of the church, like in Laodicea or in Ephesus, right? Laodicea, they're rich and they're in need of nothing, right? That sounds more familiar to my own context than Philadelphia. Or you, the Ephesian church, right? That they have lost their first love. There's something within their church, right? They're more interested in kind of, hunting false teachings than kind of the love of God in their being expressed to one another in their churches. And there's a variety of false teachings and false prophecies that are within the churches in those 7 prophetic messages. So one of the first things I always, do for the church is just think about what's going on in those churches, because it seems to me to be intentional with the 7 to represent the fullness of church. And so each of us in different contexts and kind of a global context, we can relate to different messages in different ways. And it's a call to us to be faithful in whatever context that we're in. And then the other thing I think is, as I just kind of stated in Revelation 11, right? It's kind of a representation of the ideal prophetic church, the way that the church is called to witness and to follow the example of the Lamb in a hostile world. Their witness is not violent in themselves, right? They don't take up arms to fight the beast. or the inhabitants of the earth. But it's their words, right? Their prophecy, their witness, that, definitely would include things of the Lamb, would include aspects of the Gospels, that is kind of their tool against that hostility that they faced. It says that the inhabitants of the world hate them, right? They rejoice over the two witnesses when they die. And so it caused me, and that consistently causes me to reflect. Am I following in the witness of the Lamb? Is my witness aligned with the slaughtered Lamb who is able to stand on the divine throne? How am I matching up to that example of the two witnesses?
No, that's so good. That's so good. And I love what you said really about both, because, you're so right. If we look at kind of the worldwide church, different churches in different continents and countries and their specific things they have going on, they are going to, we're going to all relate to these different churches that John's writing to in different ways. And especially, and I love what you say about the witness too. I think that there's so much there for us right now, as even culture shifts here in the U.S., as we're going through so many difficult things. There's polarization in our world like never before. And there's a sense that Revelation calls us to be faithful to Jesus in the midst of this, is not to get swept up in that,
right?
But to be a witness to Jesus during this time.
Yeah. And I think it kind of causes us to discern, right? To gauge ourselves. Are we doing a witness of the world, or does our witness align with the witness of the world? Or we could say a political party, or does it align with the Lamb, right? There may be notes that are familiar in some of those, but there, in my opinion, no kind of worldly or political expression that we encounter that fully encompasses the witness of the Lamb.
Yeah, no, that's so good. That's so good. We're called to a totally different kind of witness than we can't form fit ourselves into a pre-existing one. Yeah, that's really good. So a big question that a lot of people often have is, well, how do we understand some of these images in the book of Revelation? Like you said, there's tons of imagery, and sometimes we don't know what to do with this imagery.
Right.
So, we have the imagery of the beast. We have 666 that, is a huge one. It's even, used in movies and literature. And then, of course, we have things that aren't even in the book, like such as the Antichrist or the rapture. These things aren't even in Revelation, but somehow we associate them with them. Those words never show up. So can you tell us a little bit about these images and what are we supposed to make of them?
Yeah. So with the imagery, I like to tell a story that one of my friends and colleagues who also works in Revelation likes to tell, of a student who came to him one time and kind of asked the question, when you interpret the beast, do you interpret the beast symbolically or literally? And my friend, being very quick, says, I don't interpret the beast literally, and quite frankly, I don't know anyone who does. And so the student, kind of taken back by that response, says, well, I do. I interpret the beast literally. And so my friend responds, you believe that there will be a sea monster who has 7 heads, right? Multiple horns and crowns.
Yeah.
It's going to come out from the ocean one day, and then kind of rule the world.
Yeah.
Right. And so what that conveys is that it is symbolic. It is imagery, and all of us have in some way interpreted it in one way or another. Right. There's not a literal or symbolic type of interpretations. It's all in the end symbolic, unless someone actually believes there's going to be a sea monster, which, the world we live in, that's 100% possibility. That a sea monster is going to come from the ocean and rule the world. And so, like you said, right, the beast is usually kind of then interpreted, right, because it's symbolic, through the Antichrist idea, through different things in Paul, like the man of lawlessness, things from Daniel, right? It's all kind of composited together as this one ruler in the end who kind of represents all evil. And so, I mean, I guess there's a possibility, right, that someone like that could emerge at some point in the future, right? I don't want to discount that possibility. But again, what I consistently go back to is I want to think, what might the beast represent or speak to us today? And so where I go with that is just kind of thinking about the descriptions in the text in Revelation 13 related to the beast. In the beast, it acts deceptively. It uses deceit consistently. One thing it does is the language is that the beast is slaughtered and then raised from the dead, right? That kind of is the same thing that happens with the lamb. And from that deceit, the whole world worships this beast. And it worships, right, with this him who is like the beast, right? And who can stand against it, right? The beast represents this kind of fullness of military and political power, right? There's no earthly kingdom or ruler who's able to stand against it, right? We learn later that with 666 and the mark of the beast, anyone who doesn't take the mark, they're not able to buy or sell. Well, the only person or thing or system that can do that is someone who has this complete control over economic power.
Yeah.
Right. So what the beast does for me is it's an embodiment of this complete military and this complete economic power that the people of the earth worship. Right. So what in our own context, and I'm always, very tentative to say, this is the beast in my world, because that is just kind of gets out of hand at times. But I consistently ask, what kind of beast-like characteristics do I see in the world that are kind of beast-like in terms of what's going on, right? And so we have to, and I think this is Revelation is doing to us. I think it's its function. We have to reflect on the ways in which those political parties, in which our own governments, our own economy, the ways in which they may act beast-like. But it's not just this goal to identify it, right? Say this is that. It's also to direct us to ask, are we worshiping it? Right? Do we worship our own kingdom power? Do we worship our own economic success, our wealth, our luxury, right? Instead of the only one who is to be worshipped, the God, the creator, the one on the throne, and the Lamb. And that kind of dualism is strong throughout Revelation. It has a very kind of low viewpoint of empire and worldly things, and wants to direct us to worship of God alone.
Yeah. Oh man, that's so good, David. And I love, the fact that you've written so much on discernment and revelation, because really what you're calling us to is it is discernment. It's always discernment. Revelation doesn't give us just, easy answers. It always calls the people of God to reflect back on the world in which we live and say, what is the Spirit revealing to us about how we are inhabiting this world? What is it in our lives that are perhaps things that we're worshiping ourselves, that we're getting caught up in this beast-like things that we enslave ourselves to.
Yeah, and I think that's a function of the book on one level, right? We talked about earlier, we want to avoid it because it's hard. But I consistently wonder if we don't wrestle with the hard things in Scripture, if that kind of doesn't limit our ability to discern well.
Yeah.
Right. That this is a difficult text because the Spirit is leading us to wrestle with difficult situations. Right. Yeah. And it's almost a formative, that old word, sanctifying effect on us. That we're sanctified as we have to kind of wrestle with things that are hard. And it helps us in the future in our sanctified selves to wrestle and discern difficult things that we are consistently encountering in our world today.
Yeah, and maybe some of you guys are watching right now, and maybe you're not that familiar with Revelation. Maybe you've thought a couple times, like, man, this is so much. I'm maybe feeling a little bit lost. But the thing about stuff like this is there's no elevator pitch. There's no kind of just short, pithy little statement on this is, sort of the meaning of Revelation, because it is a tough book. And but I like what you said, David, that it's in the midst of that grappling.
Yeah.
And we're trusting God to lead us through it, that it's not that we're just getting answers, but it's that God is forming us with patience, with reliance on him, and helping become the kind of people that have this kind of discernment to understand what it is that the Spirit is saying to family worships in our church, to the church in America, to the church around the world. What is it that God's saying? And that's hard work.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good stuff, David. So this kind of our last question that we're going to get to, what concerning everything that's going on right now in our world, what does Revelation say to us today?
Yeah, I think that's a question we could spend the whole time on.
It is.
And I think it's things I've already hinted on a few times. One thing I'll say is that Revelation is one of the most theological books, kind of rich books that we have in the New Testament, right? We can learn so much about Jesus. We can learn so much about God. And we can learn so much about the Spirit, right? As a Pentecostal, I'm often offended that in my growing up, there was no discussion about the Spirit in the book of Revelation, right? It's always the Spirit's gone, which is not true. The Spirit is throughout the book, and the Spirit is there for our witness. I think there's a connection between the lampstands, that's kind of recalls the menorah in the temple, and the Spirit, that are these fiery torches. And that when the churches and the Spirit come together, the Spirit lights up the churches. And it lights up their witness, and it lights up their prophecy. And their prophecy is against, right, that empire. I think ultimately one of the things that Revelation can say to us is that it is resistant literature, right? It's about resisting the things that are enticing with power, with wealth, with luxury, with politics, right? It's a call to resist those things, and not just resist them in terms of ignoring them or not partaking in them, but an active witness against them. Again, it's not a resistance that's violent, right? They're called, the church, to follow the example of the Lamb. And the example of the Lamb is this non-violent witness, where they hear the words of the Lamb and they hate the Lamb for it, and they kill the Lamb because of it. The two witnesses, in an ideal sense, are called to do that. And it's because the Lamb's witness is self-sacrificial, right? It's about not the self. And people hate that. I sometimes don't want to hear that, right? I don't like the idea that Jesus goes to die on the cross, right? I don't like the idea that his power is achieved by dying to the empire, right? To the worldly power, right? That makes me uncomfortable at times. I don't like it, and I don't always want to follow it, but that's what we're called to do, right? We're called to be like a lamb, right? That imagery is purposeful, right? You think of a lamb as kind of a meek animal. And so in the face of this big, powerful sea beast, we have in opposition a lamb who looks as it had died. And I think that's one of the most important things that the book of Revelation tells to us, is to follow the Lamb wherever the Lamb goes. Follow the witness and the ministry of the Lamb in all that we do. Yeah,
I love that. I love that, David. Because, the same, like you said, Revelation sheds kind of a new light on Jesus, the resurrected Christ, the slain Christ, but also connects him to his ministry. And we're called to follow him, and often we find ourselves puzzled by Jesus because just like his disciples were, since we're like, this is what I thought you were going to go and kick some butt here. I thought that this was going to look a little bit different, but Jesus is showing us to live in a way that is a shining witness to the world, but in a witness that some people aren't going to respect, a witness that some people aren't going to value. But I think that, like you said, Revelation shows us so much how to do that. And ultimately, where the ultimate victory comes. It's not necessarily from how we expect God to do it or how we expect to do it ourselves, but ultimately, as Paul says, it's God dying on a cross. I mean, that's complete upside down, way that God does this, and it just doesn't make any sense to us.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah, but man, this has been such a rich conversation, and I so appreciate you taking the time. And I love that we're going to be going through Revelation. We're going to be unpacking some of these things, and I just love that you've been able to come on, kind of give us kind of a broad overview of the book, some insight into particularly how this book might speak to us in our context today, and really just appreciate you taking the time, man.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much again for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, David, and we'll talk to you soon.